Lena Jackson collapses on the cracked steps of the Wayne County Courthouse, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead as Officer Victor Rawls towers over her, his baton dripping red. The crowd gasps, assuming she's just another black woman crushed by the system. But her trembling hand clutches a hidden badge, glinting under the noon sun. She whispers, "This isn't over," her voice defiant. What sparked this brutal clash, and how will it unravel Detroit's corrupt core? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against tyranny, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales. Lena Jackson stepped through the grimy glass doors of the Wayne County Courthouse, her charcoal suit clinging to her athletic frame like a second skin, every seam pressed sharp enough to cut through the morning haze. 35 years old, with a jawline that could carve stone and eyes that missed nothing, she moved with a purpose that turned heads in the bustling lobby. Her leather satchel swung heavy at her side, stuffed with FBI files detailing the operations of Marcus Tate, a drug lord whose cartel had sunk its claws into Detroit's veins. She wasn't here as Special Agent Jackson today, though. She was undercover, posing as a paralegal named Lena Brooks, set to testify in a hearing that could crack Tate's empire wide open. Her polished Oxfords tapped a steady rhythm against the chipped tiles, each step a countdown to the moment she'd plant the first domino. The air reeked of stale coffee and desperation, thick with the chatter of lawyers barking into phones and families clutching crumpled tissues. She kept her head high, her expression a mask of calm, but inside, her pulse thrummed like a war drum. This wasn't just another assignment. This was a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers, and she couldn't afford a single misstep. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, a bottleneck of metal detectors and board uniforms herding the crowd like cattle. Lena adjusted her satchel, her fingers brushing the concealed pocket where her FBI badge lay nestled beneath a false flap. She'd done this dance before, slipping through the cracks of a system that never looked too hard at a black woman in a suit unless she made them. Today, she needed to stay invisible, just another face in the shuffle, until her testimony landed, its blow. The line crawled forward, a tangle of briefcases and muttered curses until she reached the conveyor belt. She set her bag down with a soft thud, stepping toward the detector, when a shadow fell across her path. Officer Victor Rawls stood at the center of the checkpoint, a mountain of a man with a buzz cut so tight it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. 6'4", broad as a linebacker, his uniform stretched across shoulders that seemed built to break doors rather than guard them. His pale green eyes locked onto her, narrowing into slits, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, exposing teeth yellowed from too many cigarettes. "Hold up," Rawls barked, his voice a gravelly drawl. That sliced through the hum of the room. He planted himself between her and the detector, boots rooted to the floor like he owned every inch of it. "Where you think you're going with that fancy get-up?" Lena froze, her breath catching for a split second before she smoothed it back into rhythm. She'd clocked him the moment she walked in, his posture screaming trouble, the kind of cop who got off on the badge more than the paycheck. "I'm here for a hearing," she said, her tone even, professional, the paralegal mask firmly in place. "My bag's ready for inspection." Rawls tilted his head, his smirk widening as he stepped closer, close enough that she caught the sour tang of his breath. "That's so. Looks like you're carrying more than papers in there, sweetheart. What's a girl like you hiding?" The girl landed like a slap, laced with venom, and a few heads turned, sensing the shift in the air. Lena's jaw tightened, but she kept her gaze steady, meeting his without flinching. "It's just documents," she replied, her voice a cool blade. "Everything's in order." Rawls chuckled, a low, ugly sound that rumbled in his chest, and crossed his arms, the fabric of his sleeves straining against his biceps. "Documents? Huh? Funny how your kind always has an excuse." The slur hung unspoken but heavy, his eyes raking over her like she was dirt under his boot. He jerked his chin toward the conveyor belt. "Step aside. I'm checking that bag myself." Lena hesitated, calculating. She could let this play out, keep her cover intact, but every second with Rawls was a fuse burning shorter. "It's already on the belt," she said, nodding toward the scanner. No need to delay the line. His smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl that twisted his face into something feral. "You telling me how to do my job?" he snapped, his hand shooting out to grab her satchel before it rolled into the machine. She moved on instinct, stepping forward to block him, her fingers brushing the strap. "It's standard procedure," she said, her voice firm now, the mask slipping just enough to show steel beneath. Rawls' eyes flashed, and in one swift motion, he yanked the bag free and shoved her back. Her shoulder slammed into the wall, the impact jarring her teeth, and a gasp rippled through the onlookers. Papers spilled across the floor, fluttering like wounded birds, and Lena stumbled, catching herself against the plaster. Pain flared, but she swallowed it, straightening up as Rawls towered over her, clutching her satchel like a trophy. "Suspicious behavior," he growled, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "Looks like we've got a problem here." He rummaged through the bag with deliberate slowness, tossing out pens, a notepad, a water bottle, each item hitting the ground with a clatter. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the realization that this wasn't random. He'd picked her out the second she walked in, a black woman in a suit too sharp for his liking, and now he was making it personal. "You think you're slick, huh?" Rawls muttered, loud enough for her ears alone as he pulled out a stack of files marked confidential. He flipped one open, pretending to skim it, though his smirk said he didn't care what it said. "Dressed up like you belong here, but I know better." The racial edge in his tone was a blade, cutting deeper with every word, and Lena's fingers twitched at her sides. She could feel the badge in her pocket, a lifeline she wasn't ready to pull yet, not with Tate's case, hanging in the balance. "Officer," she said, her voice low and controlled, "you're overstepping, let me through." Rawls laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the walls, and dropped the files back into the bag with a thud. "Overstepping? Nah, I'm just getting started." He turned to the scanner operator, a wiry kid who shrank under his glare. "Hold this line. We've got a troublemaker." Before Lena could protest, Rawls grabbed her arm, his grip iron tight, and yanked her toward a side corridor. She twisted, trying to pull free, but he was too strong, his fingers digging into her flesh, hard enough to bruise. "Let go," she snapped, her calm fracturing as anger bled through. He shoved her again, this time into a corner where the crowd couldn't see, her satchel swinging wildly from his other hand. "You don't tell me what to do," he hissed, leaning in close, his breath hot against her ear. "I say your trouble. Maybe you've got something illegal in here, huh? Something to explain why you're so uppity." The slur slipped out this time, raw and unfiltered, and Lena's blood boiled. She jerked her arm free, stepping back, her chest heaving as she fought to keep her cover from shattering entirely. Rawls smirked, sensing her fury, and waved the satchel like a taunt. "What's the matter? Don't like being called out?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out his radio, and clicked it on with a flourish. "This is Rawls," he said, his voice dripping with authority. "Got a suspicious female at the checkpoint. Black, mid-30s, resisting. Need backup to process her." Lena's stomach dropped. Backup meant escalation, meant more eyes. More hands, more chances for this to spiral out of her control. She scanned the corridor, the lobby a blur beyond Rawls' bulk, and saw heads turning, whispers spreading. He'd painted her as a threat, a criminal, all because she dared to walk in with her head up. Her cover was teetering, but she wasn't down yet. She squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on, her voice cutting through the static of his. "Radio. You're making a mistake, officer," she said, each word a warning he didn't hear. Rawls grinned, tossing her satchel onto a nearby table with a thud that scattered more papers. "Mistake? Nah, I'm just doing what needs doing." He stepped closer, looming over her, his baton tapping against his thigh like a promise. "You're gonna learn your place one way or another." Lena's mind raced, her training kicking in. She could take him down, snap his wrist, and have him on the floor in seconds, but that would blow everything. Tate's case, her mission, her career, all hanging on this moment. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay still, to play the part a little longer. But Rawls wasn't done. He clicked his radio again, his smirk widening as he spoke. "Make it quick. We've got a live one here." The trap was set and Lena was caught in it, her first clash with Rawls igniting a fire that wouldn't stop burning. Lena Jackson stood in the shadowed corridor of the Wayne County Courthouse, her shoulder throbbing, where Officer Victor Rawls had slammed her into the wall moments ago. Her charcoal suit was wrinkled now, a smudge of plaster dusting the sleeve, but she straightened it with a quick tug, her fingers trembling only slightly. The air buzzed with tension, the distant hum of the lobby fading as Rawls loomed over her, his baton tapping a menacing rhythm against his thigh. Her satchel lay sprawled on a metal table, papers fanned out like a crime scene, and his radio crackled with the promise of backup. She could feel the weight of every eye that had turned away, every whisper that branded her trouble before she'd even opened her mouth. Her cover as a paralegal was a threadbare shield, and Rawls was a bull ready to gore it apart. But she wasn't out of moves yet. Her right hand slipped into her pocket, brushing the cool edge of her FBI badge, and she made a split-second call. Say if he wanted a fight, she'd give him one he couldn't win, not here, not now. "Back off," Lena said, her voice a low growl, pulling the badge free and holding it up so the gold caught the dim light. "Special Agent Lena Jackson, FBI. You're interfering with a federal operation." The words hit Rawls like a punch, his smirk freezing mid-curl, his pale green eyes widening for a fraction of a second. He stepped back, the baton stilled, and the radio in his hand went silent as he fumbled to click it off. The corridor seemed to hold its breath, the air thickening with the weight of her reveal. Two courthouse guards, drawn by the commotion, rounded the corner, their boots squeaking on the tiles. "What's going on here?" one barked, a stocky man with a graying mustache, his hand hovering near his holster. Lena kept her badge raised, her gaze locked on Rawls. "This officer's harassing me," she said, her tone steady as granite. "I'm here to testify in the Tate hearing. Check my credentials if you need to." Rawls' jaw tightened, a vein pulsing in his thick neck, but he didn't speak. The guards exchanged a glance. Then the mustached one stepped forward, taking the badge with a grunt. He squinted at it, flipping it over, then handed it back with a curt nod. "Looks real," he muttered, shooting Rawls a sidelong glare. "Stand. Down, Vic. Let her through." Lena's lips twitched into a smirk, a flicker of triumph sparking in her chest. She'd turned his game on its head, stripped his power bare in front of witnesses. Rawls' face flushed a mottled red, his fists clenching at his sides, but he stepped aside, his boots dragging like they weighed a ton. She snatched her satchel from the table, shoving the scattered papers back inside with quick, precise movements, and brushed past him, her head high. His glare burned into her back, but she didn't look. She'd won this round, or so she thought, and the courtroom was waiting. The hearing room was a cavern of dark wood and stale air, rows of benches packed, with suits and spectators, the faint scent of sweat mingling with polished oak. Lena slipped into a seat near the front, her satchel hugged tight to her side, her pulse still racing from the clash. The judge, a wiry woman with a hawkish nose and a gavel that looked like an extension of her arm, presided from a high perch, her voice cutting through the murmurs as she called the case. Marcus Tate sat at the defendant's table, his shaved head gleaming under the lights, his tailored pinstripe suit a mockery of innocence. His cartel had flooded Detroit with poison, and Lena's testimony was the match to light his downfall. She adjusted her posture, smoothing her suit, and waited for her moment, the badge still warm in her pocket. She'd made it through Rawls' gauntlet, and now it was time to strike. The prosecutor, a lean man with a buzz cut of his own and a tie knotted too tight, called her forward. "The state calls Lena Brooks," he announced, using her cover name, and she rose, her Oxfords clicking a steady beat across the floor. She took the stand, her right hand raised as she swore the oath, her left resting on the satchel. The questions came fast, sharp, and she answered with the precision of a blade. Dates of shipments, names of lieutenants, coded messages she'd intercepted over months of undercover work. Tate's eyes bored into her, cold and unblinking, but she didn't flinch. The jury leaned forward, scribbling notes, and she could feel the case tightening around his neck like a noose. Halfway through, her voice steady as she detailed a drop worth $2 million, the judge slammed her gavel, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "Hold," she snapped, her hawkish eyes narrowing. "We've received a report that needs addressing." Lena's stomach lurched, a cold prickle crawling up her spine. The prosecutor frowned, stepping forward. "Your Honor?" The judge waved a clerk over, a mousy woman with glasses too big for her face, who handed her a folded note. She scanned it, her lips thinning into a line, then looked straight at Lena. "Miss Brooks, there's an anonymous tip claiming your credentials are fraudulent. I'm ordering a verification check. Hand over your badge." The room erupted in whispers, heads swiveling, and Lena's triumph crumbled like ash. She pulled the badge from her pocket, her fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside, and passed it to the bailiff. "It's real," she said, her voice firm, but the judge's expression didn't soften. "We'll see. You're excused until this is resolved." Lena stepped down, her legs wooden, and glanced toward the back of the room. Rawls stood there, arms crossed, his grin a jagged slash across his face. He'd done this, she knew it in her bones, and the realization hit like a fist. She retreated to the hallway, her satchel slung over her shoulder, her mind racing. The badge was her lifeline, her proof, and now it was gone, locked in some evidence room while they verified it. Without it, she was exposed, a target painted on her back in a courthouse, crawling with Tate's influence. She'd flashed it to shut Rawls down, thinking it would end his game, but he'd turned it against her, whispering poison to the right ears. How had he moved so fast? She leaned against the wall, her breath shallow, and pulled out her phone to call her partner. "Agent Carter!" No signal. The concrete walls blocked it, or maybe Rawls had jammed it, she couldn't tell. Either way, she was alone, and the hearing was stalled, Tate's smirk lingering in her mind like a ghost. She'd walked in with power, and now she was stripped bare, all because Rawls couldn't stomach losing to her. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and deliberate, and she straightened, her hand tightening on the satchel. Rawls rounded the corner, his grin wider now, his baton swinging lazily at his side. "Told you I'd teach you your place," he said, his voice a low rumble, dripping with glee. No badge, no fancy title, just another liar caught red-handed. Lena's eyes narrowed, her pulse hammering. "You planted that tip," she said, not a question but a fact. He shrugged, stepping closer, his bulk filling the space. "Prove it." "Oh, wait, you can't. You're nothing now." She stood her ground, her mind spinning for a counter. But he was right about one thing: without her badge, she was vulnerable, and he knew it. He turned away, whistling a tuneless note, leaving her in the silence of his victory. Her gut twisted, a mix of rage and dread. She'd won the skirmish, but he'd struck back harder, and this was only the beginning. Drop a comment with the number 1 if you think Rawls deserves to face justice for twisting the system like this. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Lena to turn the tables, and subscribe if you're ready to see this fight explode in ways you can't predict. Ever wonder how far a man like Rawls will go when his pride's on the line? What's he cooking up next to bury Lena deeper? Stick around, because the storm's just getting started. Lena Jackson stepped out of the Wayne County Courthouse hearing room, her Oxford scuffing the worn tiles as she clutched her satchel tight against her side. Her charcoal suit hung heavier now, the weight of Officer Victor Rawls' retaliation pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. Her FBI badge, her armor, was gone, locked away in some evidence vault, while the judge's verification dragged on, leaving her exposed in a building that felt more like a predator's den than a hall of justice. The hallway stretched long and dim before her, its flickering fluorescent lights casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. Her sharp brown eyes scanned every corner, every face, searching for the next blow she knew was coming. Rawls's grin still burned in her mind, that smug slash of teeth promising more than just whispers and rumors. She'd beaten him back with her badge, but he'd flipped the board and now she was playing blind. Her breath came quick, shallow, but she forced it steady, her training a lifeline in the chaos. She had to get out, regroup, call Carter, figure out how to claw her way back from this edge. The lobby loomed ahead, a swarm of bodies spilling through the glass doors into the late morning sun. She pushed through the crowd, her shoulder aching from Rawls' earlier shove, her satchel bouncing against her hip with every step. Lawyers barked into phones, their voices a dull roar while families huddled in knots clutching papers like lifelines. She kept her head down, her cover as Lena Brooks, the paralegal, fraying at the seams, but she couldn't let it unravel yet. Marcus Tate's case hung on her testimony. and if she broke now, he'd walk free, his cartel laughing all the way to the bank. She reached the exit, the cool air brushing her face as she stepped onto the cracked concrete steps, when a hand clamped down on her wrist, hard enough to twist bone. She spun, her free hand curling into a fist, and found herself staring into the flat, cold eyes of a uniformed cop, his badge glinting under the sun. "Hold it right there," the cop growled, his voice a rough scrape, his grip tightening as he yanked her arm up. Another officer flanked her, a wiry man with a buzz cut and a sneer, his hand already on his cuffs. Lena's pulse spiked, her mind racing. "What's this about?" she demanded, her tone sharp but controlled, her eyes darting between them. The first cop, a broad slab of a man with a scar slicing his cheek, smirked, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest," he said, snapping the steel around her wrists before she could pull away. The click echoed in her ears, a trap slamming shut, and the wiry one stepped closer, his breath sour with coffee. "Found something interesting in your bag during a random search," he said, holding up a clear plastic baggie, a white powder glinting inside. "Cocaine. Planted." Lena's stomach dropped, a cold sweat prickling her skin as the crowd around them slowed, heads turning, gasps rippling through the air. "That's not mine," she snapped, her voice cutting through the murmurs, her body tensing against the cuffs. "You've got no grounds for this." The scarred cop laughed, a harsh bark that grated her nerves and jerked her toward the steps. "Tell it to the judge, sweetheart, you're coming with us." She twisted, scanning the faces, and caught Rawls at the edge of the crowd, leaning against a pillar, his arms crossed, his grin a jagged wound across his face. He'd done this, orchestrated it down to the last grain of powder, turning her moment of defiance into a noose. The wiry cop grabbed her satchel, tossing it to a third officer who'd materialized from the shadows, and they hauled her down the steps, her heels scraping the concrete as she fought to keep her footing. The onlookers stared, some whispering, some turning away, but none moved to help. She was just another black woman caught in the system's jaws, and Rawls knew it. They dragged her across the plaza to a squad car parked crookedly against the curb, its lights flashing a lazy red and blue. The scarred cop shoved her into the back, her head banging against the frame, pain blooming behind her eyes as the door slammed shut. She righted herself, her cuffed hands awkward against the cracked vinyl seat, and glared through the window. As Rawls sauntered over, his baton swinging like a pendulum. He tapped it against the glass, the dull thunk a taunt, and leaned down, his breath fogging the pain. "Should have kept your mouth shut," he said, his voice low and thick with glee. "Now you're mine." He straightened, nodding to the driver, and the car lurched forward, tires squealing as it peeled away from the courthouse. Lena's heart pounded, her mind a whirlwind of plans and counters, but the cuffs bit into her wrists, a cold reminder of how deep she'd fallen. The ride was a blur of grey streets and honking horns, the cops up front swapping crude jokes, while she sat silent, her eyes fixed on the back of their heads. They pulled into a precinct 3 miles east, a squat brick building ringed with chain link and littered with cigarette butts. The scarred cop hauled her out, his grip bruising her arm, and marched her through a side door into a holding area that stank of sweat and bleach. The wiry one followed, tossing her satchel onto a desk where a sergeant waited, a barrel-chested man with a grey flat top and a smirk that matched Rawls. "Got a live one," the scarred cop said, shoving her toward a cell. The sergeant flipped, opened the satchel, pulling out the baggie with exaggerated care, holding it up like a prize. "Cocaine possession," he drawled, logging it into a ledger with a flourish. "Resisting arrest too, huh?" Lena's voice cut through the haze, sharp as a blade. "That's planted. I'm FBI. Check my badge." The sergeant chuckled, not even glancing up from his paperwork. "Badge? Heard it's fake, darling. Rawls says you fought him tooth and nail at the checkpoint." Lena's blood ran cold, her fists clenching behind her back. Rawls had been busy, spinning a web tighter than she'd imagined, and these clowns were his puppets. The scarred cop grabbed her again, shoving her into a cell, the steel door clanging shut with a finality that echoed in her skull. She stumbled, catching herself against the grimy wall, and turned to face them through the bars. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I've got people who'll clear this." The wiry cop laughed, twirling the baggie between his fingers. "Sure you do. Tell it to the judge in a week, if you make it that long." They walked off, their boots a fading echo, leaving her alone. In the dim, cold box, Lena sank onto the metal bench, her cuffed hands resting in her lap, her mind racing. The precinct hummed beyond the bars, phones ringing, voices barking, but it felt like a tomb sealing her in. Her phone was gone, snatched by the wiry cop during the arrest, cutting her off from Carter, from the FBI, from any hope of a quick fix. She'd walked out of that hearing thinking she'd dodged Rawls' bullet, but he'd reloaded with something deadlier. Planted drugs, a felony rap, a story so tight it'd hold up in any crooked court. She knew Carter would dig, would find the truth, but how long would that take? Hours, days. She couldn't sit here, not with Tate's case teetering and Rawls out there pulling strings. Her shoulder ached, her head throbbed, but she forced herself to focus, to think. She'd survived worse, broken out of tighter spots, and she'd get through this too. Or so she told herself, the lie a thin thread holding her together. The cell door rattled and she snapped upright, her eyes narrowing as a shadow fell across the bars. Rawls stepped into view, his uniform crisp despite the day's chaos, his grin a predator's bared teeth. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice a mocking purr, his baton tapping the steel. Lena stood, her cuffed hands clenched, her gaze locked on his. "You won't get away with this," she said, each word a promise. He laughed, a low rumble that shook the air, and leaned in close, his breath hot through the bars. "I already have? You're a felon now, Agent. No badge, no backup, just a number in a cage." He turned away, his boots clicking a victorious rhythm, and disappeared into the precinct's depths. Lena sank back, her gut twisting with rage and dread. She'd thought she'd won, thought she'd outsmarted him, but Rawls had buried her deeper than she'd ever imagined, and the fight was far from over. Lena Jackson sat on the cold metal bench of the Wayne County precinct cell, her wrists raw from the cuffs that still bound her charcoal suit now a crumpled shell around her battered frame. The air stank of rust and despair, the dim light flickering overhead like a dying pulse. Her satchel was gone, her phone confiscated, her FBI badge locked away somewhere in the courthouse, leaving her stripped bare in a cage rigged by Officer Victor Rawls. The planted cocaine charge hung over her like a guillotine, a lie so bold it could choke her career, her mission, her life. She'd been in there for hours, the precinct's hum a constant drone beyond the bars, her mind churning through escape plans, each one snagging on the same brutal truth. She was cut off. No Carter, no team, just her and the walls closing in. Her shoulder ached from Rawls's shove, her head throbbed from the squad car's rough frame, but she clenched her jaw, forcing the pain into a corner. She'd survived worse, she told herself, and she'd survive this. She had to. Footsteps clattered down the hall, sharp and urgent, and Lena snapped upright, her eyes narrowing as a shadow loomed beyond the bars. It wasn't Rawls this time, his swagger too distinct to miss. A figure stepped into view, tall and lean, his black suit crisp against the grimy backdrop. Agent Daniel Carter, her partner of 3 years, his dark eyes scanning her with a mix of relief and fury. His short-cropped hair glistened with sweat, his tie loose like he'd run straight from the field. "Lena," he said, his voice low and tight, nodding to the guard behind him, a lanky kid who fumbled with the keys. "We're getting you out." The cell door groaned open, the cuffs clicked free, and Lena rubbed her wrists, standing with a wince as blood rushed back into her hands. "How?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady, her gaze locking onto his. Carter tossed her satchel. Over, the leather scuffed but intact. "Took some digging," he said, his tone clipped. "Found a security cam from the checkpoint. Shows Rawls planting the baggie when he rifled your stuff. Sent it to the precinct captain. Threatened to escalate it to the feds if they didn't cut you loose." Lena's lips twitched, a spark of triumph flaring in her chest. She slung the satchel over her shoulder, her Oxford scuffing the floor. As she stepped out, the cell's weight lifting like a shed skin. "He's sloppy," she said, her voice hardening. "Thought he'd covered it." Carter nodded, leading her down the hall, past the sergeant's desk, where the barrel-chested man glared but didn't move. "He's cocky, not smart," Carter replied. pushing through a side door into the precinct lot. "Captain's got no choice now. You're clear." The late afternoon sun blazed across the asphalt, a harsh glare that stung her eyes as they crossed to her car, a sleek black sedan parked crookedly where she'd left it that morning. Freedom tasted sharp, a rush of air untainted by bleach and lies, and Lena let herself breathe, her posture straightening as she tossed the satchel into the passenger seat. "Tate's hearing stalled," she said, sliding behind the wheel, her fingers gripping the leather like an anchor. "We need to get back in there, finish this." Carter leaned against the door, his expression tight. "One step at a time. Rawls is still out there and he's pissed. Watch your back." She nodded, starting the engine with a low rumble, and pulled out, the precinct shrinking in her rear view. She'd beaten Rawls's frame up, turned his trap into dust, and for a moment, she believed she'd reclaimed the upper hand. The drive was a blur of honking traffic and grey streets, her mind replaying every move, every word, plotting the next strike against Tate. She parked outside a diner 2 miles west, a rundown joint with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered open. Inside, she ordered coffee, black and bitter, and sank into a booth, her satchel beside her, her shoulder easing as the adrenaline ebbed. She'd call Carter from a payphone, set up a meet with the team, get her badge back in play. She sipped the brew, its heat grounding her, and let herself think she'd survived the worst. Rawls was down, his scheme exposed, and she was back in the game. The thought carried her through the first sip, the second, until a crash shattered the quiet. Glass exploding across the diner floor. Lena ducked, her hand diving for the satchel, as a brick skidded to a stop inches from her booth, dust swirling in its wake. The diner's few patrons screamed, scrambling for cover, and she peered over the table's edge, her pulse hammering. Tied to the brick was a scrap of paper, its edges curling, ink scrawled in jagged red. "Snitches bleed." Her stomach twisted, a cold dread sinking in as she scanned the windows. Shadows moved outside, quick and deliberate, and the air thickened with menace. She grabbed the brick, stuffing it into her satchel, and bolted for the door, her coffee abandoned, her triumph souring fast. The lot was a chaos of gawkers, some pointing, some shouting, and she spotted them. A cluster of men, hoods up, eyes glinting with hate, their voices rising in a chorus of slurs that cut through the din. "Get her!" one bellowed, a hulking figure in a leather jacket, his face half hidden but his intent clear. Another, wiry and twitchy, hurled a bottle that smashed against her sedan's hood, glass raining across the pavement. Lena froze, her hand on the car door as the crowd swelled. 10, maybe 12 strong, their jeers a wall of noise. "Ain't no place for you here," a third yelled, his voice raw with venom, and she recognized the cadence, the spite. Rawls' crew, off-duty cops and their thug pals, unleashed like dogs off a leash. She'd seen them at the precinct, lurking in corners, laughing with him, and now they were here, his vengeance made flesh. She yanked the door open, diving inside. As a rock cracked the windshield, spiderwebs blooming across the glass. The engine roared to life, her foot slamming the gas, and she peeled out, tires screeching as the mob lunged, fists pounding the trunk. The rearview mirror framed their snarling faces, fading as she swerved onto the main road, her breath ragged, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel. She'd escaped the cell, thought she'd won, but Rawls had flipped, the script again, turning her freedom into a target on her back. The brick's message burned in her mind, a promise of blood she couldn't ignore. She sped west, the city blurring past, her eyes flicking to the mirrors for tales. Nothing yet, but the quiet felt wrong, too heavy. She pulled into a gas station lot, cutting the engine, and checked the satchel. The brick sat there, its weight a taunt, and she fished out her spare burner phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Carter. "It's me," she said when he picked up, her voice tight. "Rawls sent a mob. They trashed my car, nearly got me," Carter cursed, his voice crackling through the line. "Where are you?" She rattled off the address, her eyes scanning the lot, the pumps, the shadows. "Stay put," he said. "I'm coming." She hung up, leaning back, her shoulders screaming now, her head pounding with every heartbeat. She'd beaten the frame up, walked out free, but Rawls wasn't done. He'd rallied his pack, turned the streets into a hunting ground, and she was the prey. The diner's chaos replayed in her skull, the slurs, the hate, a tidal wave of racism she couldn't outrun. She'd thought the precinct was the worst, but this was bigger, uglier, a beast with teeth she hadn't seen coming. A black SUV rolled into the lot, slow and deliberate, its tinted windows swallowing the light. Lena tensed, her hand slipping into the satchel, fingers brushing the burner. It idled near the pumps, too close, too quiet, and her gut screamed danger. Not Carter, not yet. She started the engine, her eyes locked on the mirror as the SUV crept forward, matching her move. A tale, no doubt, Rawls' next play unfolding in real time. She pulled out, slow at first, then floored it, the sedan lurching onto the highway. The SUV's headlights flaring in pursuit. Her breath hitched, her mind racing. She'd escaped the cell, dodged the mob, but this was different. A shadow that wouldn't quit. Rawls had turned her victory into a chase, and the road ahead stretched dark and endless, a gauntlet she wasn't sure she'd survive. Lena Jackson gripped the steering wheel of her black sedan, her knuckles pale against the leather, as she barreled down the Detroit highway, the city's jagged skyline blurring into a smear of steel and dusk. The black SUV loomed in her rear view, its tinted windows a void that swallowed the fading light, its engine growling like a beast on her tail. Her charcoal suit clung to her sweat-soaked skin, the fabric torn at the shoulder where Officer Victor Rawls' earlier shove had left its mark. Her satchel jostled on the passenger seat, the brick with its scrawled threat. Snitches bleed rattling inside, a grim reminder of the mob she'd barely escaped at the diner. Her burner phone buzzed in her lap, Agent Carter's voice, cutting through the static moments ago. "Stay put, I'm coming." But staying put wasn't an option, not with Rawls' goons hunting her, not with that SUV closing the gap. She'd thought freedom was hers after the precinct, thought she'd outrun his frame-up. But now the road stretched dark and treacherous, every mile a gamble with her life. She swerved left, cutting across 2 lanes, horns blaring as she aimed for an exit ramp leading to a safe house she'd stashed in Corktown, a crumbling warehouse district where shadows could hide her. The SUV matched her, its headlights flaring like eyes in the dusk, relentless and unyielding. Her pulse thundered, her breath sharp and shallow, but she kept her focus razor-tight, weaving through traffic with the precision of a woman who'd danced this dance before. The safe house was 10 minutes out, a brick shell with a cot and a lockbox, her fallback when ops went south. She'd call Carter from there, regroup, turn this chase into a counter-strike. The exit loomed, a narrow curve over the Detroit River, its black waters glinting below the bridge like spilled ink. She gunned the engine, the sedan's tires squealing as she took the turn, her body leaning into the motion, her mind screaming one word: survive. The SUV surged behind her, closer now, its bumper kissing her tail as she hit the bridge. She glanced at the mirror, catching a glimpse of movement inside, a silhouette shifting, maybe 2. Rawls's crew, no doubt, his off-duty pals from the mob, their hate a fuel that burned hotter than reason. She floored it, the speedometer ticking. Past 80, the river a blur beneath her. But the SUV lunged, its grille slamming into her rear with a jolt that snapped her head back. The sedan fishtailed, tires skidding on the wet asphalt, and she wrestled the wheel, her arms burning as she fought to hold the line. "Come on," she hissed, her voice a raw plea to the car, to herself, to whatever kept her alive this long. She straightened out, the safe house 5 minutes away, her breath a ragged prayer when the SUV rammed her again, harder, deliberate, a predator's strike. The world tilted, metal screaming as the sedan spun, her hands useless against the chaos. The bridge's guardrail loomed, a flimsy strip of steel, and she braced, her body tensing as the car smashed through, the impact a thunderclap in her skull. Time slowed, the sedan tumbling over the edge, glass shattering in a glittering arc as it plunged toward the river. Cold air roared through the broken windshield, clawing at her face, and she fumbled for the seatbelt, her fingers numb as it clicked free. The water rushed up, black and unforgiving, and the car hit with a bone-rattling crash, the icy flood swallowing it whole. Lena kicked at the door, her Oxfords useless against the pressure, her lungs burning as the cabin filled fast. She punched the cracked window, her fist bloodying against the glass until it gave, shards slicing her skin as she clawed her way out, the river's grip dragging her down. She broke the surface, gasping, the cold a knife in her chest as she swam for the bank, her arms heavy, her satchel lost to the depths. The bridge towered above, the SUV's lights a distant glare, and she hauled herself onto the muddy shore, her suit plastered to her shivering frame. She coughed, water spilling from her lips, and collapsed onto her knees, her hands sinking into the muck. She'd made it, cheated death by inches, her breath a victory cry in the silence. The safe house was a mile off, a slog through the dark, but she could do it, call Carter, turn this nightmare around. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling, her shoulders screaming, and took a step, the mud sucking at her shoes. She'd survived Rawls' chase, thought she'd outlasted his wrath when floodlights blazed across the bank, blinding her with a white-hot glare. Lena froze, her hand shielding her eyes, her heart slamming against her ribs as three figures emerged from the light, their silhouettes sharp against the glare. Officer Victor Rawls stepped forward, his buzz cut gleaming, his uniform pristine. Despite the hour, his baton twirling in his hand like a maestro's wand. Two others flanked him, hulking shadows in tactical gear, their faces obscured but their guns drawn, barrels glinting in the floodlight's beam. "No badge saves you." "Now?" Rawls snarled, his voice a guttural taunt, his grin a slash of triumph across his scarred face. Lena's gut twisted, her mind racing for an out, but her body betrayed her, too battered to run, too cold to fight. She'd escaped the crash, thought she'd won a breath, but Rawls had tracked her, turned her survival into a trap. "You're done?" he said, stepping closer, his boots crunching the gravel as his men fanned out, cutting off her flanks. Rawls swung the baton, a blur of steel that cracked against her ribs, the pain exploding white-hot as she stumbled back, her knees buckling. She hit the mud, her hands clawing for purchase, but the first goon grabbed her arm, wrenching it behind her, his grip a vice that ground her bones. The second landed a boot in her stomach, the air rushing out in a choked gasp, and she doubled over, her vision swimming as Rawls loomed above. "Thought you'd slip away, huh?" he spat, his baton slamming her shoulder, the same spot he'd bruised before, now a furnace of agony. She gritted her teeth, her scream trapped behind them, her body a map of hurt as they beat her, fists, and boots and steel raining down. Blood trickled from her lip, warm against the cold mud, and she curled inward, her mind clinging to one thought: stay alive. They stopped, their breaths heaving in the night, and Rawls crouched, his face inches from hers, his eyes glinting with a sick glee. "You're nothing now," he said, his voice a venomous whisper, his baton tapping her cheek. "No one's coming." He stood, nodding to his men, and they stepped back, their floodlights dimming as they melted into the dark. Lena lay there, broken and bloody, the river lapping at the shore like a mournful song. Her chest heaved, each breath a knife, her hands trembling as she pushed herself up, the mud caking her torn suit. She'd survived the crash, thought she'd outrun them, but Rawls had found her, turned her escape into a slaughter. The safe house was close, her burner gone, but she crawled inch by inch, her body a wreck, her will a flicker in the black. She reached a ditch, collapsing against its edge, her eyes fluttering shut as the cold sank deeper. She'd call Carter somehow, she told herself, her voice a silent vow in the dark. She'd made it this far, clung to life when they'd left her for dead, but the cost was carved into her flesh. Rawls wasn't just a cop, he was a hunter, and she was his prey, marked for more than she'd ever imagined. Her hand clutched the mud, her badge a ghost in her mind, and she blacked out, the night swallowing her whole, her survival a fragile thread stretched to breaking. Drop a comment with the number 1 if you think Lena's grit deserves a comeback bigger than Rawls can handle. Hit that like button if you're stunned by how far this monster will go to crush her, and subscribe if you're hooked on seeing this battle twist into chaos you can't predict. What happens when a woman left for dead finds a spark to fight back? How deep does Rawls' venom run when his prey refuses to die? Keep watching, because this storm's about to rage harder than ever. Lena Jackson lay sprawled in the muddy ditch beside the Detroit River, her body a broken map of bruises and cuts, the cold seeping into her bones like a living thing. Her charcoal suit hung in tatters, soaked through with river water and blood. Her shoulder a pulsing knot where Officer Victor Rawls' baton had struck hardest. The night pressed down, thick and black, the floodlights of Rawls and his goons long faded, their boots a distant echo as they'd left her for dead. Her breath came in shallow rasps, each one a battle against the pain ripping through her ribs, her stomach, her skull. She'd crawled here inch by agonizing inch after they'd beaten her bloody, her hands clawing the muck, her will a flickering flame that refused to gut her out. The safe house was close, a ghost in the dark, but her burner phone was gone, lost. To the river when the SUV rammed her off the bridge. She was alone, cut off, a federal agent reduced to a wreck but alive. That was something. That was everything. A rustle broke the silence, soft at first, then sharper, and Lena's eyes snapped open, her hand fumbling in the mud for a weapon that wasn't there. A figure emerged from the shadows, a jogger in a neon vest, his sneakers, squelching as he froze, his breath catching at the sight of her. "Jesus," he muttered, a lanky kid, maybe 20, his phone already in his hand. "You okay? I'm calling help." Lena tried to speak, her voice a croak, but he was dialing, his voice trembling as he barked coordinates to dispatch. She sank back, her head lolling against the ditch's edge, relief warring with dread. Help was coming, but so was exposure, and Rawls wasn't done. The kid knelt beside her, his hands hovering unsure until sirens wailed in the distance, red and blue slicing through the night. She clung to consciousness, her badge still hidden in her sock, a secret she'd kept even as they'd torn her. Apart, the ambulance roared up, paramedics spilling out, their voices a blur as they lifted her onto a stretcher, her body screaming with every jolt. "Stay with us," one said, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady grip, strapping an oxygen mask over Lena's face, the cold plastic pressed against her skin, the air forcing its way in, and she faded, the world shrinking to a pinprick as they sped toward Mercy Hospital. She woke to white walls and beeping machines, her arm tethered to an IV, her ribs taped, tight beneath a gown. The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning, the room dim save for a sliver of light under the door. Her sock was still on, the badge's edge digging into her ankle, and she exhaled a shaky breath of triumph. She'd made it, a miracle carved from mud and grit, and now she could fight back. A nurse bustled in, a stout woman with grey curls, her clipboard rattling as she checked the monitors. "You're lucky," she said, her voice gruff but warm. "Cracked ribs, concussion, hypothermia, but you'll live. Docs say it's a wonder you didn't drown." Lena nodded, her throat too raw to speak, her mind already racing. She Carter needed to turn this survival into a weapon. The nurse left and Lena fumbled for the bedside phone, her bandaged hand trembling as she dialed his number from memory. "Carter," she rasped when he answered, his voice thick with sleep snapping alert at her tone. "It's me, Mercy Hospital. Rawls hit me hard, but I'm alive." He cursed, loud and sharp, the line crackling with his fury. "I'm there. In 20. What happened?" She recounted it, the chase, the crash, the beating, her words clipped and precise, and he swore again. "Stay put. I've got something on Rawls. Hang tight." He arrived in 15, his black suit rumpled, his eyes bloodshot but blazing as he strode in, a laptop tucked under his arm. He pulled a chair close, his voice low and urgent. "You're a damn tank, Lena. I dug deeper after the precinct. Rawls isn't just a rogue cop. He's tied to Tate's cartel, taking payoffs to protect their runners. That frame-up wasn't random, it was orders." Lena's gut clenched, her breath hitching as the pieces clicked. Rawls wasn't just a racist thug. He was a cog in a machine she'd sworn to dismantle. "Proof?" she asked, her voice steadying, her resolve hardening like steel. Carter flipped open the laptop, pulling up grainy photos, Rawls shaking hands with a known Tate lieutenant, cash-changing hands under a street lamp. "Enough to burn him," he said, his grin feral, "but we need it public." Lena sat up, wincing as her ribs protested, her mind spinning a plan. "Get it to a reporter," she said, her voice a blade. "WXYZ News. I know a guy, Jamal Pierce. He'll run it hot." Carter nodded, typing fast, and within an hour, the story was live. A breaking alert flashing across Detroit. Courthouse cop linked to cartel in shocking corruption scandal. Lena watched it trend on her hospital TV, the anchor's voice a hammer as Rawls' face splashed across the screen, the photos undeniable. Her lips curled, a flicker of victory warming her chest. She'd survived his ambush, turned his brutality into her weapon, and now the city knew his name for what it was. She leaned back, the pain dulled by the rush, thinking she'd flipped the script, that Rawls was cornered, his empire crumbling under the spotlight. The door burst open, shattering her moment, and Lena jolted upright, her IV tugging as Officer Victor Rawls stormed in, his uniform crisp, his buzz cut gleaming under the hospital lights. 2 uniforms flanked him, their hands on their holsters, their faces blank but tense. "Lena Jackson," Rawls barked, his voice a snarl, a warrant clutched in his meaty fist. "You're under arrest for escaping custody." Lena's heart slammed against her taped ribs, her mind reeling as Carter leapt up, his chair clattering to the floor. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, stepping between them, but Rawls shoved him aside, his bulk a wall of menace. "She slipped the precinct," Rawls said, his grin a jagged slash, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Captain's orders, move or you're next." Lena's breath caught, her victory souring fast. She'd exposed him, thought she'd won, but he'd twisted it again, spun a lie that stuck. The uniforms grabbed her arms, yanking her from the bed, her gown flapping as pain exploded through her ribs. She stumbled, her socked feet slipping on the tile, the badge still hidden but useless now. "This is bullshit," Carter snapped, lunging forward, but Rawls' baton cracked against his shoulder, sending him sprawling with a grunt. "Back! Off fed!" Rawls growled, his voice thick with glee, and turned to Lena, leaning close, his breath hot against her ear. "You think a news story stops me? I own this city." They dragged her out, her body screaming, her mind a storm of rage and disbelief. The hospital hall blurred past, nurses gaping, patients peeking from doors as Rawls marched her to a squad car, his warrant a flimsy shield for his vengeance. She sat in the back, her hands cuffed again, the steel biting into her raw wrists as the car peeled out, sirens wailing into the night. Rawls rode shotgun, his grin visible in the mirror, his baton tapping his knee like a metronome of doom. She'd survived the river, the beating, thought she'd struck back with the leak, but he'd countered harder, turned her miracle into a manhunt. The precinct loomed ahead, a brick fortress she'd escaped once, now a trap snapping shut. Her badge pressed against her ankle, a secret she clung to, but her body was wrecked, her team scattered, and Rawls was winning. She'd thought exposure would end him, but he'd doubled down, his power deeper than she'd feared, and the fight was slipping through her bloodied fingers. Lena Jackson slumped in the back of the squad car, her wrists chafed raw by the cuffs, her taped ribs grinding with every jolt as the vehicle sped through Detroit's neon-streaked streets. Her hospital gown flapped loose, a flimsy shield against the cold vinyl seat, her charcoal suit a distant memory left in tatters by the river. Officer Victor Rawls sat up front, his buzz cut a sharp silhouette against the dashboard lights, his baton tapping a steady rhythm on his knee, each thud a taunt. That echoed in her skull. The precinct loomed closer, a brick beast she'd escaped once, now swallowing her whole again under the lie of escaping custody. Her badge pressed against her ankle, hidden in her sock, a secret that felt more like a ghost than a lifeline. She'd leaked Rawls' cartel ties to the press, thought she'd landed a blow from her hospital bed, but he'd stormed in with a warrant, his power unshaken, his grin a promise of worse to come. Her body ached, her mind raced, but she clung to one truth. Carter was out there and he'd fight for her. The car screeched to a halt outside a motel instead, a squat, peeling relic on the city's edge, its sign buzzing faintly in the dark. Lena tensed, her sharp brown eyes narrowing as Rawls turned, his grin widening into something feral. "Change of plans," he said, his voice a low growl, and the 2 uniforms yanked her out, their grips bruising her arms as they dragged her across the lot. Her socked feet scraped the gravel, her hospital gown snagging on jagged stones, and she stumbled, pain flaring through her cracked ribs. The motel's door loomed, A chipped red slab flanked by grimy windows, and they shoved her inside, the air thick with mildew and cigarette smoke. She caught herself against a rickety table, her breath hitching as Rawls slammed the door shut, locking it with a click that rang like a gunshot. "No precinct tonight," he said, his baton twirling in his hand. Too many eyes. Lena straightened, her legs trembling but her gaze steady, scanning the room. A sagging bed, a flickering TV, a bathroom door ajar. No Carter, no backup, just her and Rawls' goons, their holsters glinting in the dim light. "You're digging your own grave," she said, her voice rough but firm, her mind clawing for an angle. Rawls laughed, a harsh bark that bounced off the walls and stepped closer, his bulk filling the space. "Grave? Nah, I'm burying you first." Before she could move, the uniforms grabbed her again, slamming her into a chair, their hands rough as they zip-tied her wrists to the arms, the plastic biting into her skin. She twisted, her ribs screaming, but they held firm, their faces blank masks of obedience. Rawls loomed over her, his baton tapping her knee, a slow, deliberate threat. "You thought a news story would stop me," he snarled. "I run this game." Knock rattled the door, sharp and urgent, and Lena's pulse spiked, hope flickering as Rawls scowled, nodding to one of his men. The uniform opened it, and Agent Daniel Carter stepped in, his black suit rumpled, his dark eyes blazing with relief. As they landed on her, "Lena," he said, his voice tight, shoving past the cop to reach her. "I tracked the car, you okay?" She nodded, her breath catching, the sight of him a lifeline in the muck. "Get me out," she rasped, tugging at the zip ties, and Carter pulled a knife from his pocket, slicing them free with a quick flick. Her wrists burned as she rubbed them, standing on shaky legs, her gown slipping as she leaned on him. "Rawls is done," Carter said, his tone fierce, turning to face the cop. "Captain's suspending him, story's viral, let's go." Lena exhaled, a shudder of triumph rippling through her, her body sagging against Carter as he guided her toward the door. Rawls stood frozen, his grin faltering, his baton stilled, and she thought she'd won, thought the exposure had finally clipped his wings. The uniforms hesitated, their hands twitching at their sides, and she took a step, her socked foot brushing the threshold, freedom so close she could taste it. Carter's phone buzzed, a low hum that broke the silence, and he glanced at it, his face tightening as he read the screen. "FBI's rolling in," he said, his voice steady. 5 minutes out. Lena's lips twitched, a ghost of a smirk. But then Carter's grip shifted, his hand clamping her arm too tight, too wrong, and her gut twisted, a cold dread spiking through her haze. "Carter?" she said, her voice sharp, turning to meet his eyes, but they were cold now, distant, a stranger's gaze where her partner's should have been. He shoved her back, hard, her knees buckling as she hit the floor, pain exploding through her ribs. "Sorry, Lena," he muttered, his knife flipping shut as he stepped away, locking the bathroom door behind her with a thud. She scrambled up, her hands pounding the wood, her breath ragged as betrayal sank its claws in. Rawls laughed, a deep, guttural roar, striding over to clap Carter on the shoulder, his grin reborn. "Good man," he said, tossing him a wad of cash that Carter caught with a grimace. "Tate pays better than the feds." Lena's stomach lurched, her mind reeling as the truth hit. Carter, her rock, her lifeline, had sold her out, flipped by the cartel she'd sworn to destroy. The uniforms grabbed her again, dragging her to the center of the room, her gown tearing as she kicked, her strength fading but her fury blazing. Rawls nodded to the door and it swung open, revealing Marcus Tate himself, his shaved head gleaming, his pinstripe suit crisp as he stepped in, a blowtorch in his hand, its nozzle glinting like a promise of hell. His cold eyes locked onto her, a predator sizing up prey, and Lena's breath caught, her body tensing as Rawls shoved her into a chair, zip ties snapping back around her wrists. "Have you been a problem?" Tate said, his voice smooth as oil, flicking the torch on with a hiss, a blue flame licking the air. "Time to fix that." Rawls grinned, stepping back, his baton at his side as Tate advanced, the heat prickling, her skin even from feet away. "Should have stayed down," Rawls said, his voice thick with glee, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Lena's heart hammered, her mind a storm of rage and desperation, as Tate loomed closer, the torch's roar filling the room. She'd evaded Rawls at the motel, thought Carter's rescue was her salvation, but it was a trap, a double cross that cut deeper than any baton. The news had gone viral. Rawls was suspended, and she'd breathed easy, believing the tide had turned. Now she was bound, betrayed, facing a cartel kingpin with a weapon that could melt flesh from bone. Her badge pressed against her ankle, a useless relic, her team oblivious. And Carter stood there counting his blood money, his face a mask of regret she couldn't trust. Rawls had flipped her victory into a nightmare, his reach stretching beyond. The precinct beyond reason, and Tate was the hammer to finish her. She braced, her eyes locked on the flame, her will a steel thread stretched to snapping, knowing this was her darkest hour yet. They hauled her to a corner, the chair scraping, the floor, and Tate crouched, the torch inches from her face, its heat a warning that seared her cheeks. "I talk too much," he said, his voice a venomous purr, and Rawls chuckled, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed like a king watching his court. The uniforms stood guard, their guns drawn, their loyalty bought and paid for. Lena's breath came fast, her ribs throbbing, her shoulder a furnace of pain, but she glared back, her defiance a spark in the dark. She'd survived the river, the beating, thought she'd struck gold with the leak, but Carter's knife in her back had opened a door to hell, and Rawls was holding it wide. The torch flared brighter, the room a cage of shadows and fire, and she knew she was out of moves, her fight teetering on the edge of oblivion. Lena Jackson sat strapped to a rickety chair in the dim motel room, her wrists burning where the zip ties cut into her flesh, her hospital gown a tattered shroud that barely clung to her bruised frame. The air reeked of gasoline and sweat, the flickering TV casting jagged shadows across the peeling walls. Marcus Tate loomed over her, his shaved head glistening with a thin sheen of perspiration, his pinstripe suit immaculate despite the grime around him. The blowtorch in his hand hissed, its blue flame dancing inches from her face, the heat prickling her skin like 1,000 needles. Officer Victor Rawls leaned against the wall, his buzz cut sharp under the weak light, his baton resting casually at his side, his grin a twisted slash of triumph. Two uniformed goons stood guard by the door, their guns drawn, their eyes cold and unblinking, bought by Tate's blood money. Agent Daniel Carter lingered near the bathroom, his black suit rumpled, his face a mask of conflicted shame as he pocketed. The cash rolls had tossed him. Lena's breath came in shallow bursts, her taped ribs grinding with every inhale, but her sharp brown eyes glared defiance, a steel core unbroken even as the flame edged closer. Tate tilted his head, his voice a smooth venom that slithered through the room. "You've cost me a lot, Agent Jackson," he said, flicking the torch's nozzle, the flame flaring brighter, its roar drowning out the TV's static. Time to pay it back in skin. He pressed the torch forward, the heat searing her left arm, and Lena gritted her teeth, a guttural grunt escaping as pain erupted, her flesh blistering under the assault. The smell of burnt skin hit her nose, sharp and sickening, and she jerked against the ties, her body screaming for release. Rawls laughed, a deep, rolling sound that shook the air, stepping closer to watch, his eyes glinting with sadistic glee. "Told you I'd break you," he said, pulling out his phone and hitting record, the red dot a cruel eye capturing her torment. "Smile for the camera, princess?" Lena spat at him, the saliva landing on his boot, and his grin faltered, his baton twitching in his hand. "Retract your testimony," Tate said, his tone cold now, the torch hovering over her arm, the burn, a throbbing agony that pulsed with her heartbeat. "Say it was a lie and this stops." Lena's head lolled, sweat dripping into her eyes, but she forced it up, meeting his gaze with a fire that matched his flame. "Go to hell," she rasped, her voice raw but steady, her defiance a blade she wielded even as her strength waned. Tate's jaw tightened, his calm cracking, and he pressed the torch again, this time to her forearm, the pain a white-hot explosion that ripped a scream from her throat before she clamped it down, her teeth sinking into her lip until blood trickled. Rawls zoomed in, his chuckle a dark undercurrent, and Carter shifted, his hands clenching, his betrayal a weight he couldn't hide but wouldn't undo. Lena's mind raced, her training kicking in through the haze of agony, her eyes darting around. The room for anything, any edge. The chair creaked beneath her, its legs wobbly, and she spotted a loose nail protruding from the armrest, its rusted tip glinting faintly. Her fingers stretched, trembling as the torch burned, her skin charring, and she hooked the nail, prying it free with a twist that tore her thumbnail. Tate didn't notice, his focus on her face, his patience thinning. "Last chance," he said, the flame inching toward her chest, its heat a promise of worse. Lena gripped the nail, her hand slick with sweat and blood, and waited, her breath. A countdown as Rawls filmed, his phone a taunting lens. She'd survived the river, the beating, thought Carter's rescue was her lifeline, only to face this hell. But she wasn't done. Not yet. Tate leaned in, the torch brushing her collarbone, and Lena struck, her arm snapping up, the nail plunging into his hand with a wet crunch. He roared, the torch dropping as he clutched his wrist, blood spurting between his fingers, and Lena lunged, her chair tipping as she ripped free of the weakened ties. She hit the floor, pain exploding through her ribs, but she rolled, grabbing Tate's fallen gun, a sleek black pistol that gleamed in the chaos. Rawls charged, his baton raised, but she fired, the shot deafening as it grazed his leg, blood blooming. On his uniform as he stumbled, cursing. The uniform spun, their guns lifting, and she squeezed off 2 more rounds, one shattering the TV, the other punching through the door, sending them diving for cover. Carter froze, his eyes wide, caught between loyalties as she bolted for the exit. Lena kicked the door open, her socked feet pounding the gravel, the night air a cold slap against her burned skin. Her gown flapped, her arm a furnace of pain, but she ran, the gun heavy in her hand, her breath a ragged hymn of survival. The motel shrank behind her, Tate's shouts echoing, Rawls' bellows a promise of pursuit, but she'd escaped, turned their torture into her triumph. She sprinted toward an industrial sprawl, warehouses looming like silent giants, her mind a blur of adrenaline and instinct. She'd made it out, thought she'd broken their grip when sirens wailed in the distance, a chorus that froze her mid-step. Her heart sank, her eyes scanning the dark as red and blue lights flickered on the horizon, closing in fast. A citywide alert crackled over a nearby radio. Suspect Lena Jackson, armed and dangerous, wanted for the murder of Marcus Tate. Her stomach twisted, a cold dread sinking in as she ducked behind a dumpster, her breath hitching. Tate wasn't dead. She'd seen him bleed, heard him scream, but Rawls had flipped it, framed her as a cop killer, a lie so bold it'd stick. The gun trembled in her hand, her burns throbbing, her ribs a cage of pain, and she realized the twist. Tate had faked it, staged a corpse while Rawls spun the tale, turning her escape into a death sentence. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights slicing the night, and she crouched lower, her badge still in her sock, her only proof buried. Under a manhunt she couldn't outrun. She'd fought free, thought she'd won a breath, but Rawls had countered harder, his web tightening around her, the city now his weapon. Her victory was a mirage, and the fight had just begun. Drop a comment with the number 1 if you're raging, at how Rawls keeps twisting Lena's every move into a deeper trap. Hit that like button if you're blown away by her guts to stab and shoot her way out, and subscribe if you're itching to see how she dodges a city that's turned against her. Can a woman branded a murderer claw her way back from the edge when even the air's out to get her? What's Rawls got left in his bag of dirty tricks to make sure she stays down? Stick with this ride, because the next turn's gonna hit like a freight train. Lena Jackson crouched behind a rusted dumpster in the shadow of an abandoned factory, her burned arm throbbing under the tattered hospital gown, her taped ribs grinding with every shallow breath. The Detroit night hummed with menace, helicopters buzzing overhead, their searchlights slashing through the dark like knives. Sirens wailed in the distance, a citywide alert branding her a cop killer, a lie spun by Officer Victor Rawls after she'd shot her way out of Marcus Tate's torture chamber. Her socked feet bled into the gravel, her sharp brown eyes darting as she clutched Tate's stolen pistol, its weight a cold comfort in her trembling hand. The badge in her sock pressed against her ankle, her only proof of innocence, but it was useless now, buried under a manhunt that painted her as a murderer. She'd escaped the motel, thought she'd bought time, but Rawls had turned the city into a cage, his voice crackling over every radio. Lena Jackson, armed and dangerous, wanted for Marcus Tate's murder. Her burns pulsed, her body a wreck, but she forced her mind to focus, to find a way out. The factory loomed before her, a crumbling shell of brick and steel, its broken windows gaping like empty eyes. She slipped inside, her footsteps silent on the dust-caked floor, the air thick with mildew and rust. A shattered radio sat on a crate, its static spitting fragments of the alert, and she knelt beside it, her fingers fumbling with the dials, until she found a signal. "FBI frequency," she muttered, her voice a hoarse whisper, tuning it to a secure channel she'd memorized years ago. "This is Agent Jackson," she said, her breath hitching as static flared, then cleared. "Ambushed. By Rawls. Framed for Tate's murder. Need extraction, East Side factory off Jefferson." A voice crackled back. Agent Sims, her unit's comms lead, his tone sharp with urgency. "Copy that, Lena. Team's en route. 10 minutes. Hold position." She exhaled, a flicker of hope warming her chest, and sank against the crate, the gun, resting in her lap. Help was coming, a lifeline in the dark, and she thought she'd made it, thought she'd outlasted Rawls' latest blow. The helicopters faded, their drone receding into the night, and Lena let her shoulders ease, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment, the pain a dull roar she could almost ignore. 10 minutes, she told herself, her breath steadying, her badge a silent vow she'd reclaim. She'd survived the torch, the betrayal, turned Tate's gun into her freedom, and now the FBI was closing in. Rawls was wounded, his leg bleeding from her shot, and she pictured him limping, his empire cracking under the weight of her escape. The factory's silence wrapped around her, a fragile cocoon, and she thought she'd won a breath, a chance to turn this nightmare around. Then floodlights blazed through the windows, a blinding white that seared her retinas, and her heart slammed against her ribs, her hand tightening on the gun as she scrambled to her feet. Voices erupted outside, a chorus of shouts and slurs that crashed through the walls, raw and venomous. "There she is!" one bellowed, a deep growl she recognized from the diner mob, and boots pounded the gravel, dozens strong, a tidal wave of hate surging toward her. Lena ducked behind a rusted conveyor belt, her pulse racing as shadows swarmed the factories edge, their floodlights pinning her like a spotlight on a stage. Officer Victor Rawls limped into view, his uniform stained with blood but his grin intact, his buzz cut gleaming as he waved a megaphone like a scepter. "Lena Jackson," he roared, his voice amplified, cutting through the night. "You're done running." The mob poured in, off-duty cops in tactical gear, locals with baseball bats and chains, their faces twisted with rage, their slurs a wall of sound that drowned her hope. "Murderer," they chanted. "Cop killer." The lie a hymn they'd swallowed whole. Lena's stomach twisted, her mind reeling as Rawls directed them, his wounded leg braced but his command unshaken. They'd strung a rope over a beam, a makeshift gallows swaying in the factory's gut, and her breath caught, dread sinking in like ice. This wasn't an arrest, it was an execution, a public lynching staged for the world to see. A tripod stood, nearby a camera rolling, its red light blinking as Rawls smirked, his megaphone dropping to reveal a phone streaming live. "Justice for Tate," he shouted, the mob roaring approval, their weapons glinting in the floodlight's glare. Lena gripped the gun, her burned arm shaking, her ribs a cage of pain, and scanned for an out, but they'd boxed her in, their numbers a wall she couldn't breach. The FBI was minutes away, but minutes were a lifetime now, and Rawls knew it. They charged, a hulking cop with a shaved head grabbing her arm, his fist slamming her wrist until the gun clattered free, skidding across the floor. She swung, her elbow cracking his jaw, but another tackled her, his weight crushing her to the concrete, her burns scraping raw as she thrashed. Hands seized her, dragging her toward the gallows, their grip iron tight, their slurs a barrage that pounded her skull. "String her up!" a voice yelled, a wiry man with a bat, his eyes wild, and they hoisted her, the rope looping around her neck, coarse and heavy, its fibers biting her skin. She kicked, her socked feet flailing, her taped ribs screaming as the noose tightened, the beam creaking above. Rawls limped closer, his phone raised. The live stream a window to thousands, his voice a taunt. "This is what happens to rats," he said. The mob cheering. Their hate a fuel that burned hotter than Tate's torch. Lena's vision blurred, her breath a thin thread as the rope pulled, her toes brushing the floor, her body dangling in the heat. Floodlights glare. She'd hacked the radio, called for rescue, thought she'd held the line, but Rawls had turned her sanctuary into a slaughterhouse, his mob a judge and jury with no mercy. The camera rolled, the world watching, and she clawed at the rope, her fingers bloody, her will a spark flickering in the dark. Then her foot caught a crate, a splintered edge she hooked with her heel, and she yanked, the rope slackening as she swung, her hand snagging a pipe from the floor. She swung it, wild and desperate, cracking a goon's knee, his howl a crack in their roar, and they faltered, the noose loosening as she dropped, gasping, her knees slamming the concrete. Rawls cursed, his grin vanishing as he lunged, his baton raised. But Lena rolled, the pipe swinging again, missing him by inches. The mob surged, their weapons flashing, and she scrambled up. Her body a wreck, but her fight alive, the pipe a lifeline she wielded like a blade. She'd broken free, thought she'd dodged the noose, when Rawls pulled his gun, his leg bleeding. But his aim steady and fired. The bullet tore through her shoulder, a hot lance that spun her back, blood blooming on her gown as she hit the floor, her pipe clattering away. Pain swallowed her, her vision swimming, and Rawls towered over her, his gun cocked, his voice a snarl. "Finish her," he said, the mob closing in, their chants a death knell as the helicopters roared louder. Too late, too far. She'd escaped. The motel thought rescue was near, but Rawls had staged her end, a spectacle of hate she couldn't outrun, her life teetering on the edge of his trigger. Lena Jackson sprawled on the cracked concrete floor of the abandoned factory, blood pooling from the gunshot wound in her shoulder, the hospital gown soaked crimson around the torn fabric. Her taped ribs screamed with every ragged breath, her burnt armor throbbing ruin as the pipe she'd wielded clattered uselessly beside her. Officer Victor Rawls towered above, his buzz cut sharp against the floodlight's glare, his gun steady in his blood-streaked hand, his wounded leg braced, but unyielding. The mob encircled her, a snarling ring of off-duty cops and locals, their bats and chains glinting, their slurs a relentless chant that pounded her skull. The makeshift gallows swayed overhead, the rope she'd escaped still dangling, a grim reminder of how close she'd come to death. The camera's red light blinked, streaming her torment live to thousands. Rawls' voice a venomous snarl as he barked, "Finish her!" his finger tightening on the trigger. Her sharp brown eyes flickered, her badge pressing against her ankle, a fading hope as helicopters roared closer. Their blades a distant thunder she feared wouldn't reach her in time. The air split with a deafening whomp. Black choppers bursting over the factory's roof, their floodlights blazing as FBI agents rappelled down. Boots hitting the ground with precision. Gunfire erupted, sharp and controlled, the mob scattering as bullets pinged off steel beams, their chants dissolving into screams. Rawls spun, his grin vanishing, his gun swinging toward the intruders, but an agent tackled him, his weapon skittering across the floor as cuffs snapped around his wrists. Lena's chest heaved, relief flooding her as Agent Sims charged in, his lean frame cutting through the chaos, his pistol raised. "Lena!" he shouted, dropping beside her, his hand steady as he pressed a wad of gauze from his kit against her shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. "We've got you," he said, his voice a lifeline as agents swarmed, cuffing the mob, their tactical gear a wall against the hate. Medics followed, a stretcher slamming down beside her, and Lena groaned as they lifted her, her body a wreck of pain and exhaustion, her gown flapping as they strapped her in. The factory blurred, Rawls' bellows fading as agents dragged him off, his leg dragging, his face a mask of fury caught live on his own stream. The choppers hovered, their downdraft whipping dust into a storm, and Lena's eyes fluttered, her head lolling as they rushed her out, the night swallowing the chaos behind. She'd survived the noose, fought with a pipe, thought she'd lost it all when Rawls shot her, but the FBI had swooped in, a cavalry she'd summoned with that desperate radio call. Her breath steadied, the stretcher a cradle as they loaded, her into a medivac, the roar of blades drowning her pain. She was safe, she thought, the nightmare breaking as Rawls' cuffs gleamed on the screen, his defeat broadcast to the world. The hospital loomed, a stark white fortress under the dawn. Skye and Lena woke in a sterile room, her shoulder bandaged, her ribs freshly taped, an IV dripping into her arm. The TV flickered, WXYZ News replaying the factory raid, Rawls' arrest a looping headline, "Corrupt cop cuffed live in mob attack." Her lips twitched, a ghost of triumph warming her chest as Agent Sims stepped in, his suit crisp despite the night's grind, a tablet in his hand. "You're a legend," he said, his grin tight but real. "Rawls is done. Suspension's permanent, charges piling up. Tate's lieutenants are talking too, spooked by the stream." Lena nodded, her voice hoarse as she rasped, "Good, get my badge back in play. We finish this." Sims tapped the tablet, pulling up files, and she sank back, the pain dulled by victory, thinking she'd turned the tide, that justice had finally caught Rawls' throat. A nurse slipped in, a young woman with braided hair, and a clipboard, her smile soft as she adjusted the IV. "You're tough," she said, her voice a gentle hum, and handed Lena a folded note before stepping out. Lena unfolded it, her fingers stiff, and read the scrawl. "Tate's alive. Rawls." "Cut a deal." Her stomach dropped, a cold dread spiking through her haze as the words sank in. She'd shot Tate's hand, seen him bleed, but he'd faked his death, played the corpse while Rawls spun the murder rap. Now he was alive, and Rawls had flipped, his cuffs a bargaining chip. The door creaked, Sims turning as a suit entered. A stern-faced FBI supervisor, his gray hair slicked back, his badge gleaming. "Agent Jackson," he said, his tone clipped, "you're detained pending investigation. Rawls is testifying you ran Tate's cartel, pinned every shipment on you." Lena's breath caught, her mind reeling as Sims protested, his voice rising. "That's insane, she's the victim here." The supervisor held up a hand, his expression unyielding. "He's got names, dates, says she's been deep cover for Tate all along. Evidence is being reviewed." Two agents stepped in, their faces blank, and cuffed her wrist to the bed, the steel cold against her raw skin. She tugged, pain flaring through her shoulder, but they held firm, their loyalty a wall she couldn't breach. "This is Rawls," she said, her voice a snarl, her eyes blazing at the supervisor. "He's lying to save himself." He shrugged, turning away. "Prove it from custody. You're off the board until we sort this." Sims lunged forward, arguing, but they pushed him out. The door slamming shut, leaving Lena alone, the cuffs a new prison. The TV looped Rawls' arrest, a hollow victory now, his grin replaced by a calculated smirk she could feel through the screen. She'd escaped the gallows, thought the choppers were her salvation, but Rawls had turned her rescue into a deeper trap, his deal with Tate a masterstroke that buried her under her own mission. Her badge sat on the bedside table, retrieved but useless, a taunt as the supervisor's words echoed. She was the cartel's puppet, not its hunter. Her shoulder throbbed, her burns pulsed, but her mind raced, clawing for a counter. Carter's betrayal had cut deep, but this was worse. A systemic knife that turned her team against her. She'd fought free, thought justice was hers, when a shadow passed the window, a flicker of movement that chilled her blood. She twisted, her cuffs rattling, and saw Rawls outside the precinct cell across the street, his cuffs gone, his limp pronounced but his posture smug. He met her gaze through the glass, his grin a slash of triumph. A phone pressed to his ear as he spoke, his lips moving in a silent promise. He'd cut a deal, pinned it all on her, and walked free, his power flexing even from a cell he'd soon leave. The supervisor's investigation was a sham, a delay to let Rawls' lie take root, and Lena sank back, her breath shallow, her hope a flicker in a storm. She'd survived the factory, thought the FBI had her back, but Rawls had flipped it, turned her saviors into jailers, and now she was detained, a scapegoat in a game she'd never played. Her fight hung by a thread, the hospital a cage, and Rawls' shadow loomed larger than ever. Lena Jackson lay cuffed to a hospital bed in Mercy Hospital, her shoulder a throbbing mass of bandages, her burned arm wrapped in gauze that itched against her raw skin. The sterile room hummed with the beep of machines, the IV dripping a slow, rhythm into her vein, her hospital gown a thin shield against the chill seeping through the walls. Her taped ribs ached with every breath, her sharp brown eyes fixed on the ceiling, her badge resting on the bedside table, a taunt of her stolen freedom. Officer Victor Rawls had flipped her rescue into a trap, his deal with Marcus Tate pinning her as the cartel's mastermind, a lie that turned the FBI against her. The supervisor's words echoed in her skull, detained pending investigation, her career, her fight, shackled by cuffs that bit into her wrists. She'd seen Rawls outside, free despite his arrest, his grin a promise of victory as he'd spoken into a phone, his wounded leg a badge of his defiance. Her team doubted her, her hope frayed, but she wasn't done. Not yet. The door creaked, a guard stepping in, a burly man with a buzz cut and a bored scowl, his keys jangling as he checked her chart. Lena's mind raced, her training a lifeline. In the haze, and she spotted his holster, the gun a glint of opportunity. "Water," she rasped, her voice weak but calculated, nodding to a pitcher across the room. He grunted, turning his back, and she moved, her free hand snagging the IV needle, yanking it free with a sting that barely registered. She lunged, her cuffed wrist straining as she jammed the needle into his neck, her other hand snatching his gun as he staggered, his yelp cut short by a choke. He crumpled, his keys clattering, and she grabbed them, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the cuffs, the steel falling away with a soft clank. Her breath hitched, pain flaring through her shoulder, but she stood, the gun heavy in her grip, her gown flapping as she slipped into the hall. The hospital buzzed, nurses chattering, carts rattling, and Lena moved fast, her socked feet silent on the tile as she ducked into a stairwell, her body a wreck, but her will iron. She knew where Rawls was, the courthouse, his hearing set for dawn, a stage to cement, his lie. She'd stolen Tate's ledger during her motel escape, a blood-smeared book of names and deals she'd stuffed in her gown, a secret she'd kept through the torture. It was her trump card, proof Rawls and Tate were the puppets, not her, and she'd wield it like a blade. She swiped a coat from a locker, shrugging it over her gown, the gun tucked inside, and slipped out a side exit, the dawn sky a bruise of purple and gold. Her sedan was gone, but a delivery truck idled nearby, its driver unloading crates, and she climbed in, hot wiring it with trembling hands, the engine coughing to life as she peeled out, the courthouse 10 minutes away. The Wayne County Courthouse loomed, its cracked steps swarming with reporters and gawkers, the hearing a circus under the morning sun. Lena ditched the truck a block off, her coat flapping as she limped through the crowd, her burns pulsing, her shoulder a furnace of pain. She slipped inside, the lobby a chaos of suits and shouts, her sharp eyes scanning for Rawls. The hearing room was packed, benches groaning under the weight of spectators. The judge's gavel a sharp crack as she entered, her stolen gun a hidden weight. Rawls sat at the witness stand, his uniform pressed despite the bloodstain on his leg, his voice smooth as he spun his tale. Agent Jackson ran Tate's ops, fed us lies, shot him to cover her tracks. The gallery murmured, the jury scribbled, and Lena's blood boiled, her hand clutching the ledger beneath her coat. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the din, raw but steady. "That's a lie," she said, her socked feet planting firm as head swiveled, gasps rippling through the room. Rawls' grin faltered, his pale green eyes narrowing, and the judge slammed her gavel, her hawkish glare pinning Lena. "Who are you?" she barked, and Lena pulled the ledger free, holding it high, its pages stained with her blood. "Special Agent Lena Jackson, FBI," she said, her tone a blade. "This is Tate's ledger, real proof Rawls and Tate ran the cartel, not me." She tossed it to the bailiff, her eyes locked on Rawls, his face paling as the room erupted, reporters shouting, the jury leaning forward. "Check the dates, the payoffs," she said, pointing at him. "He's the rat." The judge ordered silence, her gavel a thunderclap, and the bailiff flipped through the ledger, his voice rising as he read, names, deals, Rawls' initials on every page. The gallery roared, a tide of outrage, and Lena pressed on, her breath shallow but her words steel. "He framed me, tortured me, staged a lynching, all to bury this." She pulled the gun, not to shoot but to show, slamming it on the table, its barrel glinting. Tate's alive, hiding, and Rawls cut a deal to pin it on me. The crowd surged, fists pounding benches, and Rawls lunged, his baton swinging from his belt, his wounded leg buckling as he aimed for her skull. Lena ducked, her training snapping. In and grabbed his arm, twisting it until the baton clattered free, her knee slamming his gut. He doubled over, gasping, and she shoved him back, his confession spilling as she yanked his phone, hitting record. "Say it," she hissed, her voice a whip, and he choked out, "I worked for Tate," the mic catching every word. The room exploded, agents storming in, their badges flashing as they cuffed Rawls, his bellows drowned by the chaos. The judge pounded her gavel, her voice lost in the uproar, and Lena stood, blood dripping from her shoulder, her burns a map of her fight, thinking she'd won, that the ledger and confession had shattered Rawls' lie. The gallery chanted her name, a swell of fury and awe, and she leaned against the table, her breath of victory cry, her badge reclaimed in spirit if not in hand. Rawls was dragged out, his grin gone, his leg dragging, the live stream a noose around his neck now. She'd broken free, turned the courthouse into her battlefield, and exposed the truth, her triumph a fire that burned through the pain. "The tower," Judge called order, her voice faint, and Lena exhaled, her body swaying, believing the storm had broken, that justice had finally caught up. Then a red dot danced across her chest, a sniper's laser slicing through the chaos, and Lena froze, her sharp eyes darting to the balcony, a shadowed figure perched high, the glint of a rifle catching the sun. Her heart slammed, her breath catching as the crowd hushed, heads turning, the dot a silent threat that pinned her where she stood. Pain flared through her shoulder, her burns, but she held still, her mind racing as agents shouted, their guns. Swinging up, she'd fought free, thought she'd ended Rawls, but this was new, a shadow beyond his reach, a final blow she hadn't seen coming. The ledger had won the day, her stand had broken the lie, but the laser trembled, a promise of death she couldn't dodge, her victory teetering on the edge of a trigger. The room held its breath, her fight a fragile thread, and she braced, her sharp eyes locked on the dark, knowing this wasn't over. Lena Jackson stood in the Wayne County Courthouse hearing room, her bandaged shoulder a throbbing anchor under the borrowed coat, her burned arm trembling as she gripped the table for balance. The air crackled with chaos, the gallery a sea of shouting reporters and spectators, their voices a tidal wave crashing against the judge's gavel, its sharp cracks lost in the uproar. Officer Victor Rawls sprawled on the floor, his buzz cut matted with sweat, his wounded leg twisted beneath him, his baton skittering away as agents pinned his arms, cuffs snapping tight around his wrists. The ledger she'd thrown to the bailiff lay open, its blood-smeared pages a damning map of his crimes with Marcus Tate, her sharp voice still echoing from forcing his confession, "I worked for Tate." The stolen gun rested on the table, a silent witness to her fight, her socked feet planted firm despite the pain ripping through her taped ribs. She'd broken free from the hospital, stormed the hearing, turned Rawls's lie into her triumph, but a red laser dot danced across her chest, a sniper's mark from the balcony that froze her blood, her sharp brown eyes locking onto the shadowed threat. The dot quivered, a heartbeat of menace, and the room erupted anew, agents shouting, their guns swinging toward the balcony as the crowd ducked, screams piercing the din. Lena dove, her body a reflex of survival, the bullet slicing through the air where she'd stood, grazing her arm with a hot sting that ripped a grunt from her throat. The shot cracked off the wall, plaster raining as chaos swallowed the courthouse, agents storming the stairs, their boots a thunderous drumbeat. She hit the floor, rolling behind the witness stand, her breath ragged, her burned arm smearing blood across the wood as she clutched it, pain a white-hot flare that blurred her vision. Rawls laughed, a guttural roar from his pinned spot, his pale green eyes glinting with sick glee, even as agents dragged him up. His confession still live on his phone, streaming to the world. "You're dead anyway," he spat, his voice a taunt as they hauled him out, his leg dragging, his grin a promise unbroken. Gunfire popped above, sharp bursts as agents clashed with the sniper, a cartel hitman in black, his rifle flashing before. He crumpled, a bullet through his skull dropping him like a stone. The laser vanished, The balcony a haze of smoke and shouts, and Lena staggered up, her coat flapping, her shoulder leaking fresh blood through the bandages. Agent Sims burst through the melee, his lean frame cutting a path, his pistol holstered as he grabbed her arm, steadying her. "You're clear," he said, his voice tight, nodding to the fallen hitman. "Tate's cleanup crew, tying loose." "Sims?" She nodded, her breath a hiss, her sharp eyes scanning the room as the judge pounded her gavel, her hawkish glare a futile call for order. The gallery surged, fists raised, voices chanting her name, a swell of outrage and awe that shook the walls. And Lena stood taller, her pain a badge of her fight. Agents swarmed, securing the scene, their badges glinting as they pushed back the crowd. The bailiff clutching the ledger like a holy relic. The judge's voice broke through, sharp and commanding. "Order! This court is adjourned!" And the room began to empty, reporters scrambling, their cameras flashing as Rawls disappeared down the hall, his bellows fading into the chaos. Lena sank against the stand, her body a wreck, her gown peeking from the coat, her badge reclaimed from the hospital table now a weight in her pocket. She'd done it, turned the sniper's shot into her survival, Rawls' confession into his noose, and the ledger into Tate's downfall. Sims handed her a wire, a tiny mic she'd worn under her gown, its recorder blinking green. "Got it all," he said, his grin fierce. Rawls, Tate, the hit. Global now. She exhaled, a shudder of triumph, the stream a weapon that'd bury them both. The courthouse steps loomed as they escorted her out, the dawn sun blinding, a harsh glare that stung her eyes. Tate's empire was cracking, his lieutenants flipping as the ledger's truth spread, his faked death a desperate play that crumbled under her stand. Rawls faced life, his deal void, his confession a chain he couldn't break, and Lena limped forward, her socked feet scuffing the concrete, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. Agents flanked her, their voices a hum of strategy, planning raids, arrests, the cartel's endgame unfolding in real time. She'd won, a victory carved from blood and grit, her name afire on every screen, every tongue, a federal agent who'd shattered a corrupt core. Her shoulder throbbed, her burns pulsed, but she stood tall, the pain a testament to her fight, thinking the storm had finally broken, that justice had tipped the scales. A child darted from the crowd, a girl no older than 10, her braids bouncing as she pressed a photo into Lena's hand, her small fingers trembling before she vanished back into the throng. Lena froze, her breath catching as she unfolded it, the image a punch to her gut. Her sister Aisha missing 3 years, her face smiling in a snapshot from a park, a red X scrawled across her eyes. A note clung to the back, ink jagged and fresh. "You're next." Her sharp eyes widened, dread sinking in like ice as she scanned the faces, the agents oblivious, their focus on the victory she'd handed them. Aisha's disappearance had driven her to the FBI, a wound she'd buried under missions, and now it was here, a threat tied to Tate, to Rawls, to a shadow she hadn't seen. Her triumph soured, her chest tightening, the photo a bomb that shattered her win into dread. She limped forward, the crowd parting, her coat flapping as agents urged her to a waiting van, their voices a distant hum. "Tate's alive," she muttered, her voice a blade, clutching the photo as Sims turned, his brow furrowing. "What?" he asked, but she shook her head, her mind racing, the note a promise of a fight unbroken. Rawls was down. Tate's empire teetered, but this was deeper, a vendetta that stretched beyond the cartel, beyond the courthouse, into her blood. Her shoulder bled through the bandages, her burns a map of her war, but she straightened, her sharp, eyes glinting with a fire that refused to fade. She'd won the battle, turned the sniper's shot into her stand, but the war loomed, a shadow with Aisha's face, and Lena knew she'd walk into it, her fight far from over. The van door slid shut, the engine rumbling as they pulled away, the courthouse shrinking in the haze. Tate's lieutenants would fall, Rawls would rot, the ledger and wire sealing their fate, a victory that'd echo through Detroit's corrupt underbelly. But the photo burned in her hand. Aisha's smile a ghost that haunted her, the note a whisper, a vengeance she couldn't ignore. She'd stood up, revealed the truth, broken the beast that hunted her, But the cost was a scar reopened, a sister lost, a threat reborn. Her sharp eyes stared out the window. The city a blur of steel and smoke. Her resolve a steel thread stretched taut. The fight had just begun, a storm she'd face alone. Her triumph a fleeting light in a darkness that waited, patient and cruel. Lena Jackson's journey in Racist Cop Harasses Black Woman in Court, until she stands up and reveals she's an FBI agent, offers raw, unfiltered lessons about resilience, justice, and the pervasive grip of systemic racism. Her fight against Officer Victor Rawls and Marcus Tate reveals that courage isn't just surviving brutality. It's standing up when the world bets against you. Lena faced harassment, torture, betrayal, and a city turned hostile. Yet she wielded her intelligence and grit to expose corruption, proving that truth can cut through even the thickest lies. Her story teaches us that systemic injustice thrives on silence, and breaking it demands relentless defiance, even when the cost is personal. Her sister's haunting reappearance, a stark reminder of that toll. Another lesson lies in the power of evidence and strategy. Lena's stolen ledger and hidden wire turned Rawls' own tools against him, showing that preparation can topple giants. Yet her victory's fragility, marred by a new threat, underscores a bitter truth. Justice is a battle, not a finish line. Racism doesn't vanish with one win. It morphs, striking from shadows, as seen in the note about her sister. This story urges us to question who holds power, to challenge narratives and to fight for those buried by them. Like Lena did, even when the odds stack higher with every step. So, what's your takeaway? How far would you push against a system rigged to crush you? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit like if Lena's fire inspires you, subscribe for more tales of grit and justice, and share this to spark the conversation. Thanks for riding this storm with us. Here's to strength in the face of darkness, and may you find your own ledger to turn the tide.